Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on just one day, September 23rd, 2025, a really high stakes day. We've sifted through a huge stack of source material to bring you the essential insights. Our goal here is to show you how seemingly separate events are actually deeply interconnected. We're looking at three main areas. First, the geopolitical scene, particularly the tensions and, frankly, fracturing alliances at the UN General Assembly. Second, something huge, the incredible scale of this new AI infrastructure race, just staggering numbers. And third, the domestic turbulence back in the US, budget standoffs, big policy shifts.
Yeah, and if you look at the sources from that day, what really jumps out is this friction, right? On one hand, you've got private ambition hitting scales like $500 billion infrastructure deals. But on the other hand, public governance seems almost stuck, facing constant friction. Think about the looming U.S. government shutdown threat, or industries paralyzed by cyber attacks, or even a super typhoon testing a city's resilience.
Yeah.
We really need to connect these dots for you because it feels like the pace of private change is just completely outpacing public policy's ability to keep up.
Okay, right. Let's start unpacking that on the world stage then. The UN General Assembly, UNGA, President Trump's address. It felt like classic America First, didn't it? We saw the themes, hardline asylum policies, cuts to foreign aid, that aggressive stance on tariffs kind of hanging in the background.
Exactly. And that skepticism towards, multilateralism, it set a very sharp tone. He really used that platform to deliver some broadsides against the UN's effectiveness overall. He specifically hit out at Europe's grain policies, their migration policies, even saying countries were going to hell if they didn't clamp down harder on migration. Strong stuff.
And the reaction was, well, immediate and pretty much split right down the middle, as you'd expect. Supporters were saying, look, this resonates with voters worried about borders. But critics, they argued this kind of talk undermines U.S. leadership just when you need more global cooperation, not less.
And that criticism feels particularly sharp when you look at his shift on Ukraine that same day. It was a really interesting pivot, considering the political leverage he might be aiming for.
Wait, hang on. Why the pivot on Ukraine right then? If you'd been skeptical before, musing about both sides maybe needing to give up territory, what changed? What does this sudden shift tell us?
Well, it signals a strategic adjustment. On the 23rd, he did this major pivot, suddenly stating Ukraine can win back all territory lost to Russia. That's a huge reversal. It sends a strong signal to NATO allies. And he followed it up by signaling NATO should be ready to shoot down Russian aircraft if they violate Allied airspace.
Wow, okay, that is a massive shift from previous statements.
And it connects directly to that rising NATO-Russia friction we also saw evidence of on the 23rd. Right. NATO condemning that Russian fighter jet breach over Estonia. Precisely. And then Lithuania's parliament steps up, passing a law allowing their military to shoot down drones violating their airspace.
Yeah.
It underscores this really tense cat and mouse game along the borders. So you have this high level talk about winning territory, but it's being backed up by these very localized specific policy changes, like allowing shoot downs designed to raise the stakes without, tipping into full conflict.
Okay, so that's friction heating up in the East. But then the Gaza-Palestine crisis showed a major fracture, maybe, within the West. Reports showed intensified fighting, at least 36, maybe 38 Palestinians killed just on September 23rd. And the humanitarian situation sounds just devastating almost 2 years after the October 7th attacks.
Yeah, really grim. And then Israel announced it was shutting the Allenby Bridge, the King Hussein Bridge, indefinitely. That's the only passenger crossing between the West Bank and Jordan. So that immediately puts a huge strain on humanitarian access, on diplomacy, right when the crisis is peaking.
But the bigger geopolitical tremor maybe came from Europe, a really significant break from past Western policy. France, along with Belgium, Luxembourg, Malta, Andorra, Monaco, 6 countries, they formally announced at the UNGA that they were recognizing Palestinian statehood.
That's critical because it signals that even smaller, historically sort of non-confrontational EU members are breaking ranks.
Yeah.
They seem to view the current U.S.-Israel approach as just untenable. It's not just the number of countries, it's who is involved.
Right.
Major EU players like France making it clear they're charting an independent course now. And of course, Israel and the U.S. immediately condemned it. So it makes it starkly clear. Western approaches to this conflict are diverging fast, which really complicates any hope for near-term peace talks.
Right, so you have this deep, visible fragmentation on the world stage, which stands in such stark contrast to the kind of singular focus and alignment we're seeing in these infrastructure wars, specifically AI compute.
Exactly. This is where we pivot from political friction to just raw private sector acceleration.
And the numbers, honestly, they almost defy belief. Nvidia plans to invest up to $100 billion in OpenAI, plus a commitment to supply just massive volumes of data center GPUs. I mean, that's a corporate investment on the scale of a small country's GDP. $100 billion, and you mentioned $500 billion earlier. That's not just infrastructure. That sounds more like nation building. It links to that project called Stargate, right? OpenAI, Oracle, SoftBank, detailing this $500 billion plan across 5 U.S. sites. Sources say they're aiming for nearly 7 gigawatts of power capacity over several years. 7 gigawatts.
That's approaching the power needs of entire small countries.
It is a staggering power target, and the sheer scale, it raises huge questions. And its trust, for one, because this alliance could pretty much lock in NVIDIA's dominance in AI compute. But for you, listening, the really big consequence is energy. 7 gigawatts isn't just a big electricity bill, that's potentially a grid reliability nightmare. The private sector is building this enormous energy demand, and utilities, regulators, they're going to have to scramble to manage it.
And speaking of speed, the market's reacting instantly. Micron reported its Q4 results, topping guidance that they had already raised, driven by demand for that ultra-fast memory, HBM and DDR5. Right? HBM, DDR5, that's the really fast memory you absolutely need for these giant AI servers. So Micron beating expectations. It just reinforces the view that this AI-driven demand for memory could last well into 2026. Sources confirm this isn't some speculative bubble. It's a fundamental, multi-year reshaping of global data infrastructure, driven by real, sustained demand for these specialized parts.
So that's the promise of this new infrastructure. But then there's the operational reality, extreme vulnerability. We saw some very concrete examples of cyber threats just shutting down industry. Jaguar Land Rover JLR, they had to extend plant stoppages until at least October 1st. This followed a major cyber incident earlier in the month.
Yeah, and that stretches the production pause to about 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Affecting tens of thousands of workers, not just at JLR, but across their supply chain too. It really shows how tightly linked and therefore how vulnerable modern manufacturing is.
And it wasn't just private industry. Public infrastructure got hit too. Sophisticated hacks caused major disruptions at some of Europe's busiest airports, Heathrow included. Took out automated check-in, baggage systems. So you've got this $500 billion AI infrastructure promise on one side, and on the other, massive multi-week production shutdowns because of cyber attacks.
And that juxtaposition, the huge promise right next to these crippling shutdowns, that is the story of 2025 in a nutshell. It's a massive vulnerability.
Okay, let's bring in the third piece then. The internal friction within the U.S. that seems to prevent addressing these vulnerabilities, investing in public resilience. The U.S. government was, yet again, staring down a potential shutdown ahead of the October 1st fiscal deadline. Fights over healthcare funding, program priorities.
And the political brinkmanship just ramped up sharply on the 23rd. President Trump abruptly canceled a planned White House meeting with Democratic leaders Schumer and Jeffries. Said talks wouldn't be productive unless Democrats basically gave in on key demands first. So again, you see this contrast. Huge private AI investment, while public infrastructure, the grid, the regulatory bodies faces internal political paralysis.
And even regulatory independence seemed under threat. The Supreme Court ruling about the president's authority to dismiss Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, the last Democrat on the FTC. What does that ruling actually mean?
Well, in simple terms, it affirms the president has the power to remove heads of traditionally independent agencies like the FTC for pretty much any reason, not just for cause-like misconduct. So this decision really streamlines executive power, makes it much easier to quickly reshape the regulatory landscape for consumers, for tech, including how those giant AI entities we just talked about might be overseen.
We also saw a quite radical policy controversy bubbling up in public health. The administration announced new vaccine recommendations, suggesting splitting the MMR shot measles, mumps, rubella, advocating for delayed immunization schedules, proposing removing aluminum from vaccines. And these were backed by HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Dr. Mehmet Oz.
Yes, and it's really crucial we report the reaction accurately based on the sources. Major medical organizations, including the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they immediately and strongly condemned these proposals. They warned these suggestions were misleading, potentially dangerous, and could lead to lower vaccination rates, risking disease outbreaks, a direct clash with established public health guidance.
Finally, underlying all this was climate infrastructure being tested by actual events. Super Typhoon Regasa, 2025's most powerful storm apparently, hit Hong Kong hard. Citywide shutdown, over 700 flights canceled.
Right. And at the same time, Hurricane Gabrielle hit Category 4 out in the Atlantic, prompting a hurricane watch for all of the Azores. These extreme weather events just put enormous stress on cities, on risk management, which brings us sort of full circle back to the policy pushback we saw on climate action that same day?
Ah, right. That came from major automakers. They urged the EPA to actually relax the emissions targets for cars in the 2030 to 2032 model years. They argued that EV incentives were expiring, infrastructure bottlenecks were real, and it was all undermining their ability to meet the current aggressive schedule.
So you literally have industry asking the government to slow down the transition. At the exact same time that extreme weather events are screaming for faster, more resilient infrastructure and energy solutions,
Hmm.
the pace of reality is clashing hard with the pace of policy.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. September 23rd, 2025. On one hand, a world stage defined by polarization, fragmentation, you saw it at the UN, in the split over Gaza policy. In the US, budget battles threatening a shutdown, even the weakening of regulatory bodies.
hmm But running completely parallel to that political gridlock, you have private industry moving at just lightning speed, fundamentally reshaping global infrastructure with these enormous AI compute projects like Stargate, demanding 7 gigawatts of power, dominating specialized markets.
So it leaves you with a pretty critical question to think about. When private sector ambition gets this big $500 billion for one project, what happens when the public system's needed to support and govern it? U.S. budget process, international cooperation, cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. What happens when those public systems are simultaneously facing constant friction, shutdown threats, and these paralyzing cyber vulnerabilities?
That stark contrast, the massive accelerating private scale versus the volatile, sometimes paralyzed public sphere, that really feels like the core tension defining this moment. We hope this deep dive helped you see those connections clearly.